Has the international community avoided a world war?
This was a confrontation between reluctant actors, not actors that were itching to enter into an all-out war.
Fears of a widespread international conflict arose recently when two old adversaries, Israel and Iran, exchanged missile attacks. Night skies over Jerusalem were lit up when Israel, with the help of its allies, intercepted most of the Iranian missiles. So, what does this all mean? Is a new regional and even global conflict still on the cards? Or now that temperatures have cooled a little, has the world avoided a potential war? That's our topic this week here on Put Simply. I'm Erdem Koch, and our guest this week is Ali Vaez, the director of the Iran project at the Brussels-based NGO, the International Crisis Group. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He joins us from his home city of Washington, D.C., and is chatting all things Iran this week with Ozan Ibrisim.
Ali, welcome to Put Simply. It's a real pleasure to have you. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. I direct the Iran project at the International Crisis Group. Basically, I cover everything Iran related. Primarily in the past few years, the focus has been on the Iranian nuclear program, and I'm a nuclear expert, non-proliferation expert. But over the years, of course, we have also covered many other aspects of Iran-related policy, Iran's role in the region. And as you well know, Iran is involved in everything that is happening from Yemen all the way to Israel-Palestine. And then, of course, there's a complex domestic picture as well, whether it's the economic situation affected by sanctions and mismanagement and corruption, or whether it's the political dynamics in the country. So it's there's a lot to deal with.
And we're going to get to particularly the nuclear deal and some of those other issues that you mentioned. But as a starting point, obviously what's made the headlines recently has been the recent conflict between Israel and Iran. There is a long history of tension, and I know it's going to be very difficult to kind of put that simply. We could probably spend hours talking about it. But could you help us to understand briefly where the tensions come from and why are we where we are today?
Sure. Look, the Iranian revolutionaries who came to power in 1979 not only had sympathy for the Palestinian cause, but also had a very close relationship because they did not expect quick victory in the Iranian revolution. They expected guerrilla fighting and insurgency that would go on for years and years. And so they had got training from Palestinian groups. And so as soon as they came to power, they kicked out the Israeli de facto representatives in Tehran and gave the building of Israeli embassy to Yasser Arafat and developed a very close relationship with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. But then over the years, the concept for the Iranians changed from some kind of an ideological animosity towards Israel to a strategic one. Iran in the 1980s was invaded by its neighboring Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And it felt a sense of strategic solitude because almost the entire region and the world powers were supporting Saddam, and Iran was alone. And so it opted to go for a classic policy of strategic depth, which is basically hiring partners and proxies away from your border to deter a direct attack on your soil that you cannot properly defend because of your shortcomings in terms of conventional military capabilities. And so what the Iranians did was in 1982 was first to create Hezbollah in Lebanon. Because Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 had created a fertilized ground for this objective. And they continued this approach over the years in other countries as well. But the key here is that as a Persian nation surrounded by Arabs and Turks, and as a Shia nation surrounded by Sunni countries, the only way that Iran can project power overcoming all of these inherent limitations is to pick up a cause that allows it to play the role of a trans-Islamic power and not a Shia power. And that cause was the Palestinian cause that was left on the ground by the Arabs after repeated defeats by Israel. And so Iran basically instrumentalized the Palestinian cause and turned this animosity towards Israel into one of the pillars of its defensive doctrine. So that's where the animosity comes from. But there's no historic reason Persians and Jews should be enemies. There is no territorial disputes between Iran and Israel. And so this is purely a strategic and ideological animosity.
Just picking up on the strategic element of it, we hear a lot in the headlines that Iran, as you mentioned, is involved in a number of proxy wars, such as the one we have in Yemen. Where does the Iranian objective stand when it comes to the region and its geopolitical kind of objectives? And what are its relationships like with some of the other kind of wider powerful countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar? Can you talk a little bit more about what they're trying to achieve in a lot of the things that they're doing today?
Yeah, so let me make two general points. One is that Iran is not an expansionist power. It is one of the biggest countries in that part of the world, so it's not in search of new territories. But it is an opportunistic power in the sense that it is a master of exploiting chaos. And whenever there is an opportunity, whether it's Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 or U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, or the Syrian civil war in 2011 that turned into a proxy conflict, or the war in Yemen in 2015, Iran usually comes in on top of those conflicts and exploits chaos in order to recruit these non-state actors that would then allow Iran to project power way beyond its borders. Second, going back to what I said initially, is that if you look at Iran and compare it to other countries, other powers in the region like Turkey or Saudi Arabia, the difference is that Iran is not part of any network of security. It doesn't have a security guarantor. Like Turkey is a member of NATO, for instance, right? Or Saudi Arabia is a member of GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and also benefits from the support of the United States. Iran doesn't have any of those options. And plus, from a conventional military perspective, it has been under an arms embargo for many years, and so it had to rely on its own indigenous capabilities. It has developed asymmetric capabilities like its ballistic missiles program, which today is the biggest and the most sophisticated arsenal in the region, or its drones that it has proliferated to state actors like Russia or non-state actors like the Houthis or Iraqi militias. But overall, Iran basically tries to make up for the fact that, unlike other big powers in the region, it's encircled by U.S. forces. Every day they look off their shores in the Persian Gulf. There is a 40,000 strong armada. It's excluded from the regional security architecture, and it's embargoed. By relying on these two policies of forward defense, which is again this concept of having a network of influence through non-state actors, and its asymmetric conventional military capabilities. So that's the logic in Iranian approach. The problem with it is that, of course, what Iran sees as defensive comes across to other countries in the region as offensive, especially those that have had historic rivalries with Iran, like Turkey, of course, that has been fighting over the same areas in the Levant with Iran since the time of the Ottoman Empire, and even before that, even the Roman Empire. And with Saudi Arabia, again, it's a historic rivalry. But even some smaller countries in the region that feel insecure when they look at this massive state that is developing these asymmetric capabilities. So what these countries do is that they often drag the United States further in order to support them and double down on buying sophisticated, cutting edge military capabilities. That in turn deepens Iran's threat perception and pushes Iran to double down on those two problematic policies. And this vicious cycle, unfortunately, repeats itself.
I suppose focusing on the current conflict, a number of weeks ago, commentators were suggesting that we're on the verge of a serious conflict between Iran and Israel that could spill over into a regional, if not a global conflict. However, it seems that things have calmed down somewhat. Israel has not retaliated for now. Could you give us some understanding of how this most recent conflict came about, and where do you think it's going in terms of, is it likely to intensify? What do you think that each side is likely to do next?
Sure. Let me start by giving a little bit more background about this network that Iran has in the region, which is referred to as axis of resistance, resistance towards hegemony by the United States and Israel in the region. It's a network that includes groups like the Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi Shia militias, and in the past few years have been dozens of these groups that have different relationships with Iran, and then also some militias in Syria, which include Afghan and Pakistani militias that Iran recruited during the Syrian civil war. And Palestinian groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. And finally, the crown jewel of this network, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Iran has a different set of relations with these groups. With Hezbollah, they really act like two NATO allies in terms of the degree of trust and coordination and even delegation of responsibilities. And with the Houthis, they're not really an Iranian proxy. They have a long track record of ignoring Iranian advice. They're fiercely independent. And so these are the two ends of the spectrum. And then you have different groups in Iraq and Syria and Palestinian territories along this axis in different categories. Now, Hamas has had a rather problematic relationship with Iran. Hamas is a Sunni group, is more affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood ideology than the Shia ideology of the Iranian ruling elite. And so what Hamas did on October 7th was actually not coordinated with Iran, and Iran was taken by surprise of the catastrophic success that Hamas had and the atrocities that they committed in Israel. And it put Iran in a very difficult position because Iran was on a different wavelength at the time. It had de-escalated its tensions with the United States. There was last summer a informal understanding between Iran and the U.S. that basically Iran got some economic reprieve through unfreezing of some of its frozen assets, and in return, it slowed down some aspects of its nuclear program. It reined in the groups in Iraq and Syria that were targeting U.S. forces, and it even committed not to transfer ballistic missiles to Russia to use in its war of aggression against Ukraine. And all of that fell apart on October 7th because, of course, Iran is complicit in the long-term support that it has provided for Hamas, even though it had no foreknowledge of the exact operation that was taking place on October 7th. And since then, different parts of this network have been activated to support one member that is now under assault, Hamas. But they've done it in a way to try to avoid tensions from boiling over and resulting in a full-fledged regional conflagration. So Hezbollah, for instance, in the north, have had almost daily tit-for-tat engagement with Israel, still within certain rules of the game, with the aim of trying to avert uncontrolled escalation. The Houthis in Yemen have targeted shipping in the Red Sea and have even fired drones and missiles towards Israel. The Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria conducted more than 175 attacks against U.S. forces in those countries. And Iran itself was basically sitting back and supporting these groups, but not engaging in direct action against Israel until on April 1st, Israel killed two senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders at the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So both the high-ranking nature of the targets and also the location, which was a diplomatic facility, technically speaking, based on Vienna conventions, should be immune from this kind of attack, put Iran in a position that it felt that it needed to respond. And it went first to the UN Security Council, hoping to get some kind of condemnation that was blocked by the West. And then it really thought that it had to do something to restore deterrence against Israel. But it still did not want to trigger a regional war. And so the way Iran responded was to basically give plenty of advance notice to Israel and the United States through indirect channels of communication with the US, telling them exactly what they were planning to do. And then the opening salvo of Iranian attack against Israel on April 13th and 14th was very slow-moving drones that would take 6 hours to get to Israel. And all of that was aimed at making sure that they could reduce and minimize death and destruction, so that the spectacular nature of the attack that was really made for TV would help Iran restore deterrence against Israel, help save face at home against in front of groups, core constituents of the regime that were very unhappy with its lack of response against Israel in the past few months, and yet try to avoid any further escalation. 99% of Iranian drones and missiles, more than 350 of them that were fired against Israel, were shot down with Israeli air defense systems and with assistance from the US, the UK, France, and Jordan. There was only one Bedouin girl who was unfortunately killed, but no massive destruction or fatalities. And Israel, a few days later, on April 18th, responded with a pinpoint, really, attack on an Iranian air defense system very close to Iran's key nuclear facility in Isfahan. And that was for Israel, too, to signal that it has not been really deterred, that it can reach very sensitive facilities within the Iranian territory. And so, although that episode did not result in a regional conflagration, I think the fact that we saw for the first time an Iranian attack on Israel directly from its own territory, and Israeli response in a way that was still within the category of covert operations that Israel has conducted against Iran for many years, but nevertheless more brazen, has put us in a situation that the old rules of the game between Iran and Israel are gone, and the new rules are not yet set in. And in that space, in that ambiguity, there is plenty of risk for miscalculation because, of course, the underlying tensions that gave rise to this tit for tat are still there. The war in Gaza is ongoing, and there's at the moment not a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. Tensions between Israel and Hezbollah on Israel's northern border are there, and the Houthis are continuing to attack shipping in the Red Sea. And at any moment, advertently or inadvertently, there could be an incident that would result in tensions spiraling out of control.
And if those tensions were spiral out of control, and as some commentators have suggested, we end up having a much broader conflict it's very clear, I think, to most people that the US and its allies would come to the defense of Israel. But realistically, in your opinion, which countries are likely to come to Iran's assistance, and why?
Well, look, no one really. So I think it's slightly exaggerated when people talk about World War III. But there is a real risk of regional war between Israel and its allies and Iran and its allies. I don't think you would see Russia and China, for instance, getting dragged into this kind of confrontation. It would still be devastating. It would still send shockwaves around the world. Energy prices would certainly get affected because of the fact that there will be certainly tensions in the Gulf region as well, not just in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. There will be waves of refugees coming out, new waves of radicalization. So it would have shockwaves around the world. But I think it would remain limited to a Middle Eastern war, not a world war. And even that, at this stage, I wouldn't put the odds of it very high, because reality is, we have all the key actors, Iran and the United States primarily, and even to a certain degree Israel, are reluctant to get engaged in an all-out war, and that's why they handled this episode in April with a lot of cautiousness. This was a confrontation between reluctant actors, not actors that were itching to enter into an all-out war. An incident happened based on, I believe, an Israeli miscalculation, that they thought Iran was just going to absorb the attack on its consulate in the same way that it had absorbed previous Israeli killing of senior Iranian military officials in Syria, or Israeli covert operations in Iran against Iranian nuclear scientists, nuclear facilities, military facilities, and even commanders. And that was, of course, a miscalculation. But from that point on, and everybody tried to contain tensions. And even the Iranian attack, was very flashy, but not fatal. And again, that was by design, even though it had a massive amount of risk associated with it. An Israeli response was, again, very limited against Iran. This all indicates that all of these key actors are reluctant to stumble into an all-out war, at least not yet. But that's also not a guarantee that it would not happen, because of course we have the World War I example of reluctant actors entering into a war that they optimistically believed would be a quick one, and turned into a massive global disaster. In this case, again, the risk of regional conflict, I would not put them above 30% at this stage, but even that is too high in my book.
That's a relief to hear. Straight after the atrocious attacks of 7th of October by Hamas, we had quite a bit of criticism of the Biden administration. In fact, I think some in the Republican Party at the time started or were blaming the Biden administration for one of its policy actions, which I understand was to remove the waived funds for humanitarian purposes, or waive the sanctions on the funds for use for humanitarian purposes. And I think the criticism went along the lines of, if Iran didn't have access to this money, then it wouldn't be able to fund, Hamas attacks. I know this caused quite a bit of debate and discussion, but could you put simply for us, is there any validity to this, or is it just political kind of criticism of Biden?
It's certainly part of the political football in Washington. And, I love this saying that Washington is an island surrounded by reality. It's absolutely nonsensical, because we now know that Hamas's operation was in the making for 2 years. This is not something that you can do overnight. The funds that you're referring to are related to that de-escalatory understanding that I mentioned Iran and the US reached last summer, which included a prisoner swap and a humanitarian deal. The U.S. and Iran both released 5 prisoners, and in conjunction with that, the U.S. also released $6 billion of Iran's frozen assets in South Korea and moved them to Doha in a humanitarian channel where Iran did not have access to the funds, but could submit orders to the Qataris for food and medicine and medical equipment that the Qataris would then run by the U.S. And after the U.S. would give the green light, they would process the order and ship the goods to Iran. So Iran would not have access to the money at all. That deal was finalized on September 18th, just 2 weeks before October 7th. So I think it's really unrealistic to believe that the missing ingredient in all of this was the money that Iran didn't even have access to. Plus, all the Biden administration did was basically implementing existing U.S. laws. U.S. laws exempt food and medicine from U.S. sanctions. So Iran should have had access to this money all along, even without doing the detainee deal. Because that is again, enforcing existing U.S. law. So this is of course political season in Washington, and it is very easy with a country that has been demonized in the U.S. for many years, like Iran, to put the blame of October 7th not on Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies towards Hamas, or the injustices that were committed against the Palestinians for decades and decades, but to put it on Iran and then blame the Biden administration for granting Iran access to funds that it actually didn't have access to.
This is going to be probably a difficult question to answer simply, but over the past few years, we've seen quite an increase in anti-government protests, many movements popping up in Iran. What is the current political environment in Iran like? And also, what would you say a lot of Iran's posturing at the foreign level or the international level as a part of trying to unify what seems to be a bit of a fragmented political situation domestically?
Look, Iran, I think, is where the Soviet Union was in the early 1980s, not in the late 1980s. Early 1980s because that is when there was a regime, the Soviet Union, that was ideologically bankrupt, politically at a dead end, economically in deep troubles that it really could not resolve. But not the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, because this is still a regime that has the will and a fearsome capacity to repress and remain in power. So you now have in Iran a situation that the majority of the Iranian people have given up on the regime, who in turn has also given up on the majority of the Iranian people and is relying on a small minority of 10 to 15% of the Iranian population that for ideological, financial reasons is vested in this regime. And this creates all sorts of tensions, of course, as you can imagine. Even the regime's own surveys indicate that 85% of the Iranian people are dissatisfied with the status quo. That gives rise to a lot of discontent that shows itself in almost constant protests in different forms, but also at outbursts of rebellions, really, against the regime that are becoming more frequent and more violent every time. On the other hand, you have a regime that has really, it's the saying that revolutions eat their children. In the case of the Iranian Revolution, is also ate its fathers, and you have a core of the system that has been shrinking over the past few decades, and is now left with really a very small group of ultra hardliners who are in charge. Because the most important question internally is none of the things that we've discussed so far, but it's a question of the succession of the supreme leader. who turned 85 just 2 weeks ago. And who and what comes after Ayatollah Khamenei would be the most important question in terms of vested political and economic interest in the system. And so there is a lot of focus among the political elite on trying to make sure that who is in charge of the key institutions of power at that pivotal moment in the country's history. So it is a very unstable situation, and it's a situation that is not certainly sustainable. But I don't think anyone can predict, what comes next, because you might have a situation in which you would have continuity, that you would have another supreme leader. This would be a transition that we've only seen once in the Islamic Republic's history in 1989 when the current supreme leader came to power. So there's not a lot of points of comparison, but it could be, kind of a mirror image of what happened then. Or you might have a situation in which the Revolutionary Guards, which is the most powerful institution in the country right now, and it has its tentacles everywhere in the economy, of course, in military security, in cultural spheres, in everything, really. That they would be the ones who would take over either from behind the curtain, so you'd have a situation that is similar to Pakistan or Egypt, that you would have a civilian face, but it's really the military that is running the show from behind the scenes. Or you would have a situation in which a military junta is actually running the country. All of those possibilities exist, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the country politically. But one thing that is certain is that the current situation is just not sustainable.
We can't have a conversation about Iran in the region and not obviously talk about the nuclear deal, which was negotiated by the Obama administration in 2005, and subsequently President Trump withdrew the US out of this deal in 2018. Could you put simply for us what this deal was trying to achieve and what it means for the US to pull out? Does it make it more likely that we're going to see Iran obtaining nuclear weapons in the future, and what that would mean regional and global security?
Sure. Look, in 2003, it was revealed that Iran had a secret nuclear program that it had not announced to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear watchdog. And since then, we've had a nuclear crisis with Iran, and there's been a lot of ups and downs diplomatically to try to find a solution for this. The Europeans, France, UK, and Germany initially started negotiations with Iran from 2003 to 2005, and they managed to get Iran to suspend its nuclear program. But those negotiations fell apart because the US was seeking a maximalist solution in which it basically wanted Iran to completely shut down its nuclear fuel cycle activities, and the Iranians didn't agree to that. And then we entered into a phase of massive confrontation, primarily through sanctions that saw unilateral, multilateral, international sanctions coming into force against Iran, turning Iran into the most sanctioned country in the world. And I've co-authored a book on this subject called How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare. So there's a long history there. And then, in parallel, Iran's nuclear program grew very quickly, and it reached really a critical stage. And that's when the Obama administration decided to step aside from that maximalist position and agree that Iran would have a limited and highly monitored uranium enrichment program on its own soil. But because, of course, like any other negotiated agreement, it was not a perfect deal. It created, there was a lot of resistance towards it in Washington. And the deal was finalized in 2015, but already out of 2016 electoral cycle, all the Republican candidates promised to tear it apart. And of course, President Trump came to office and eventually did that in 2018. Now, when President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, it would take Iran about 12 months to enrich enough uranium for a single nuclear weapon. Today, that timeline is 6 days. So by putting aside the U.S. commitments in the deal and reimposing sanctions on Iran, what the Trump administration did was basically to take Iran's nuclear program out of a box in which it was under lock and monitoring and put it in a microwave. So all the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, of course, came off. Transparency of the program went down, and Iran significantly expanded its nuclear program. The Biden administration came in 2021 with the promise of restoring the agreement, but they were not willing to pay the price of. They were not willing to pay the price of dealing with the enemy early on, and that burned a lot of opportunities with Iran. And in 2022, when the Biden administration was ready to actually restore the deal, the Iranians were no longer that interested, and they were seeking that the U.S. provides them with guarantees that it would no longer renege on its agreement with Iran. And so the negotiations fell apart. And towards the end of 2022, with the massive uprising in Iran that was violently crushed, and intelligence came to surface about Iran providing drones to Russia, it became politically really impossible to try to restore the deal. And last year, as I mentioned, the Biden administration went for a very, a much more narrow approach of trying to just put a lid on Iran's nuclear activities until after the U.S. elections in November of this year. And even that wasn't very successful because, as I said, since October 7th, the U.S. has also reneged on those commitments with Iran. And so we are now in a situation that Iran is closer than ever to the verge of nuclear weapons. The West has maxed out its leverage by sanctioning almost anything that moves in Iran. Now, there is the possibility of doubling down on enforcement of some of these existing sanctions, especially Iranian oil exports to China. But that will also come at a cost for the Biden administration in an election year if the price of gas at the pumps goes up, or if it increases tensions with China. And so it's easier said than done. But even if that is achieved, I would say the dial of sanctions, which is currently 8 out of 10, would maybe go up to 9 out of 10. And the Iranian economy has survived 8 out of 10 on degrees of sanctions. It's not thriving for sure, it's struggling, but it has survived. Iran can still significantly escalate its nuclear program, which would increase the risk of crossing a red line that would trigger a U.S. or Israeli military strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities. And so that's another file that is extremely concerning, especially in the context of regional tensions that we were talking about. Because the more the U.S. or Israel succeed in weakening Iran's regional deterrence by, for instance, destroying one of the members of Axis of Resistance, Hamas, or after that going after Hezbollah, for instance, or weakening Iran's conventional military capabilities by stricter export control or sanctions or even targeting of Iran's capabilities. The more they fail by pushing Iran towards the ultimate deterrent, which comes in the form of nuclear weapons. And again, as I said, Iran is very close to it. It would probably take Iran about 6 months to manufacture a nuclear weapon. And as I said, it would take them 6 days to get the material for it, but another 6 months to manufacture it. And I'm afraid that possibility is becoming more real by the day. During the tit-for-tat with Israel, for instance, we heard for the first time an Iranian military official talking about the possibility of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons, which was something that they had denied for years. It was in their intentions, and the supreme leader has a religious edict against weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. So that's another issue that unfortunately is extremely concerning.
We'd like to finish on a positive note, on put simply. So could you tell us whether you have hope that we can get closer to peace in the broader region, and what would need to happen for that to occur?
Look, it's very hard to be hopeful at this moment about the future of the region. But maybe there are two things that I can draw from this rather gloomy picture. One is the fact that in crisis there is opportunity, and I think with everything that has happened since October 7th, there is realization that the Palestinian issue cannot remain unresolved, and this is a wound that would continue to fester and destabilize the rest of the region. And so there is now more, I think, realization of the fact, which is, by the way, wasn't really the case prior to October 7th. The U.S. was trying to normalize Saudi Arabia's relations with Israel in the way that the prior administration, the Trump administration, had brought about normalization between the UAE or Bahrain or Sudan with Israel under the so-called Abraham Accords, and the concept was to completely go around the Palestinians. I think that image has completely changed now. Now, whether this 75-year-old conflict could be resolved, it's not hard. It's not easy to be optimistic about. But at least the realization that it cannot remain unresolved, I think, is a positive. Second thing is that we have also seen, at least in the sub-region, in the Gulf region, that everything that has happened since 2019, when the Trump administration doubled down on an enforcement of sanctions against Iran, and Iran lashed out by targeting Saudi oil infrastructure, shipping in Persian Gulf, and UAE interests and ports. Since then, I think there is a realization in the Gulf region that a zero-sum approach towards some of these historic rivalries between Iran and its neighbors are just will create lose-lose dynamics. And of course, since then, we have seen normalization of relations between Iran and the UAE and then the Saudis. And everything that has happened in the past 7 months since the war in Gaza started is yet another reminder that these countries cannot flourish economically and live in peace and prosperity when the rest of the region is burning. Now, again, that's not a solution, but it's a realization that I think is fundamental in trying to find a solution.
Ali, you've done an amazing job to really unpack and put simply what is an incredibly complex and difficult topic. We thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure having you on, put simply.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you very much.
And that's been this week's episode of Put Simply. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Oroka Group to stay up to date with all the latest episodes and news. Feel free to leave a comment and suggestions on what you'd like to see featured on the podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrisim.
Thanks for listening.